Meet three women who face the challenges of working in sports media. Next on a special edition of Carpe Diem. Hello and welcome to Carpe Diem. I'm Marc Rosenweig, Associate Professor in the School of Communication and Media at Montclair State University. A new study by the Women's Media Center shows that the top 20 news outlets in our country, only about 30% of the stories are reported by women. We explored the challenges facing women on the sports beat during a panel discussion at the Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center on the MSU campus. Our panel included ESPN editor Claire Smith, who will be the first woman inducted into the sports writers wing of the Baseball Hall of Fame this summer, plus record sports columnist Tara Sullivan and MSU assistant professor Kelly Whiteside. I asked Claire Smith about an incident in 1984 when she was physically removed from the San Diego Padres baseball clubhouse because she's a woman.
That was the worst day of my career, and it was truly the only really bad day of my career, and I've been doing this for 35 years. So to honor all the women who had it so much worse than I did, I must put it in that perspective. I had one bad day. I was the beat reporter covering the Yankees for the Hartford Courant, assigned to that postseason. We had assurances that because the leagues ran the clubhouses in the postseason and then the commissioner's office ran the clubhouses in the World Series, there would be no access problems. Whatever the club's rules were during the season would not take hold in the postseason and going forward. Now, that mattered in the National League, the league I was assigned to cover, because the National League teams were still in '84, still allowed to set their own rules. American League had universal rules. If you had a credential, you were allowed in any American League clubhouse. If you were a credentialed member of the media, you were allowed in. It didn't seem to matter to the Padres that we had received written assurance that I would be able to cover the playoffs, and my first foray into the locker room after the game, I was not just escorted out, I was physically pushed out. Hand was put on my back and I was pushed out of the clubhouse towards the door. There was a lot of verbal abuse from a certain group of players. And I've spoken to a lot of my peers from back in the day, Lisa Nea Saxon, Lisa Olson, Susan Waldman, and so on and so forth. We kind of made a deal. We're not naming the bad guys anymore. Their 15 minutes are up. I choose to concentrate on the players, the coaches, the managers, the commissioner, who that day said no more, changed the rules, provided the quotes, stood by me, my peers in the media who did the same. So what happened, Henry Hecht of the New York Post saw me outside the clubhouse needing to do my job but being prevented from doing my job. He whisked by and he said, "What do you need?" And I said, "I need quotes." "Who do you need?" And I said, "Please tell Steve." He knew that I meant Steve Garvey. Steve and I had been friends since I was in college, because I was a Dodger fan, and we had met in Philadelphia because Steve was a fan of fans, and we had spoken to each other for years. he had written to me about my desire to be a sports writer, and back and forth. And so Henry went in and told Steve. Steve was holding court, if you will, with the media in the clubhouse, and Henry kind of pushed through and told him what had happened. Steve excused himself from the bulk of the media and came out into the corridor. There are no corridors in Wrigley. There were just crawl spaces, but he left the clubhouse and came out. At that point, I really started to get very emotional and lose it, because it was quite traumatic. Dick Williams had just growled at me and reiterated that I was not allowed in his clubhouse. Jack McKeon, the general manager, had basically wimped out and said, yeah, this is Dick Williams's clubhouse. I have no say over what Dick Williams does. I might be his boss, but it's his clubhouse. So I was kind of losing it a bit, and Steve came out and he sensed that, and he said, I will stay here for as long as you need me to, but you have to get yourself together. You have a job to do. What do you need? And just like that, I pulled myself together. I got the quotes I needed from a Padre on what was a losing team, and I was able to file a story with quotes from both clubhouses. Walked across to the Cubs. By then, the Cubs had heard what happened, and they were furious because it happened in their house, and there were a lot of ex-Yankees on the Cubs, and they couldn't believe what had happened. They were familiar with my work ethic, and they were not having it. So there was a kind of a rebellion in the Cubs clubhouse, and Steve Garvey was upset. I came to find out the next day that Goose Gossage was furious when he heard what his teammates had done. And then, lo and behold, the new commissioner, Peter Uberoth, who'd been on the job for about 4 or 5 days, when he heard, he also said enough is enough, and he did what the American League president had long ago done. He said anybody who has a credential, is a credentialed member of the media, has access to any major league clubhouse, and he opened all the clubhouses.
That was the worst day.
Yeah.
That was the worst
Absolutely.
day. Yeah.
And nothing ever came close to that. Nothing. I have friends, we all have friends, who probably had days like that 5 days a week, or if they work 6 days a week, 7 days a week. I think we're all blessed that we worked in a rather sophisticated New York City with players who chose to be here, knew what they were buying into via free agency, lots of college educated players. And by the time we came along, we were covering 2 baseball teams that kind of wore it as a badge of honor that these things did not happen in their clubhouses. But if you were out in maybe a 1 newspaper town, and it was easier to harass and get away with it because there wasn't going to be as much publicity, or 8 other newspapers there chronicling what you were doing. Who would then make a story
out of what you had done.
Exactly,
right,
with 10 cameras.
Yeah, there are witnesses.
Witnesses,
yeah.
exactly.
In the bigger markets, you might have the bad apple in the locker room, the one guy who didn't want women in there or whatever, but he would, generally speaking, be drowned out by the others. In some of the other cities, you might flip that equation. So
Exactly.
yeah.
Now you experienced something at the Masters in Augusta some years ago. Share that experience
it's funny.
with us.
We don't want to talk too much about ages, but in 1984, Kelly and I were in high school when other people were fighting the battles, that we ultimately would benefit from. But there are always going to be small setback. So yeah, in 2011, I was covering the Masters, and it was the year, if anybody remembers, Rory McIlroy had gotten out to a huge lead, and he was young and kind of the next big star. It looked like he was going to win his first Masters, and he completely imploded on the Sunday. Really fell apart by the 9th hole. He was spraying it into the cabins and off the fairway. And so in the meantime, the other golfers who had pushed past him were people like, I think it was Carl Schwartzel of South Africa, who ended up winning that Masters. And from a columnist point of view, I wasn't really interested in writing a Schwartzel column. He wasn't going to carry the day, really, I thought, for me. So I thought the most compelling story was still Rory McIlroy, because the way the Masters works, the leaders in the last group, and generally speaking, when they are going to win, they carry the crowds. It's this fabulous scene. But now instead, there's nobody in the galleries, and he literally is fighting back tears. At times you have a lone voice, we still love you, Rory. I mean, it was just, sometimes there's better stories in the losers, right? We all, as columnists, as editors, we've all recognized that. The emotion is there. So I had gone back outside by the back nine to walk with Rory and to sort of experience that whole thing. Now, for anybody who doesn't know, at the Masters, it's like going back in time to cover the Masters. There's no phones out there, there's no electronic scoreboards, there's no TV screens, there's nothing. So you have to go out. It's the best reporting in the world, because you have to go out there to do it. You have to be out there to experience it, other than watching it on TV inside the media room. Anyway, by the end of the round, he's done, he's lost, he's making his way toward the locker room, which when I say locker room, I mean that not in like the most official sense. They had a different locker room they used, but they had one in the main clubhouse near the main house that everybody sees on TV, that they kind of would collect mail or change their shoes or whatever. And when they came off the course, golfers tend to stop and do a little more media. Obviously, Rory wasn't going to go to the interview room. The guy was devastated, right? So this was our chance to talk to him. Sometimes they stop after they sign the card. Sometimes they stop if there's a big famous tree outside the clubhouse. And sometimes they go all the way to the locker room. He decided to go all the way to the locker room. Sometimes they don't stop at all, but he did. Anyway, you go in the one door of the locker room, it goes down a hallway, and there's another door that gets into the locker room. And we entered, I was trailing at the back because I was sort of watching everything. And when I went through that first door, I was the last one to reach the security, and this woman who's like a rented security person says, "You can't go through." And I said, "No, I'm with the media," and she said, "No, they don't allow women in the locker room." And it was exactly like what Claire is describing when Baseball Raid changed its rules. I said, "No, look, like this credential allows me in. It's the same credential." And I tried to explain to her, like, this had already been decided in federal legislation. Like, if this is where the interviews are happening, I have access. But she wasn't having it, and of course you can factor in the Masters is at Augusta National, which only recently admitted its first female member. So, it had been subjected to all these protests over that policy. So certainly that played into it. But much like Claire, I would like to say the one thing that carried over, when I couldn't get in, the last reporter right in front of me happened to be Bill Platschke, who is a friend of mine, and if you know him, he's one of the best columnists in the country at the Los Angeles Times. And he just turned to me and I said, go in, like, you need to do your job. And he said, "I'll get you, and I'll bring out whatever it is." Bill is not a recorder, like he didn't have anything with him, so he came out and shared. Meanwhile, like, I went out and tried to report something else. I thought maybe I'll one-up them, right? You got Garvey in the hallway. I'm thinking, I'll go find maybe Rory's mom or dad or something better. Unfortunately, I didn't find anything outside, and Bill came out and read me his notes, which was fine. But then another reporter, and I'm not even sure he's still working, John Romano was his name, working in Florida, when we were inside in the media room, came over and said, "I heard what happened. I transcribed the entire interview. I'll email it to you," which was tremendous. But anyway, so the story continued. When I'm out there, I can't get any help, right? There's nothing I can do because there's no Masters people there to go to, and I don't have a cell phone. I don't have anything. There's no way I can reach anybody. So when I got back to the media center, I happened to tweet about it. Now here's the lesson in, right, time passing. I tweeted something about bad enough they didn't have a female member, but not letting me join my colleagues to do the interviews is just wrong. Well, talk about going viral. My world went nuts, and I'll get to the role Kelly played in a minute, because now I've put myself in the position where it's important to share it. It had to be exposed, but I also was on deadline, right? So I'm sitting in my chair, and now people are coming to my chair to interview me about what happened, but I still have to write so I'm starting to lose it, right? I'm starting to lose it. So what do I do? like get my phone, and I went up, I'm not joking, into the bathroom and closed the door, and I called Kelly. So for those of you who don't know, Kelly and I were actually roommates in college. She is among my closest friends, and I'd like to think vice versa. And Kelly was the one who kind of talked me, this is why we need each other. She kind of talked me in off the ledge, and she said, turn off your phone, get off the internet. Focus on your column, because I'll tell you what, everybody's going to read it tomorrow. Now that they've heard your name, everybody's going to pay attention. So write your column. And I was completely 100%, I did not want to write the column about myself. I would tell people about my experience, but I was not going to be the front page column on the Record the next day that I got banned from the locker room. I still wrote a Rory McIlroy column. Then, in addition, I wrote like a brief first-person piece on what had happened that they put inside, but I refused to make myself the story at that point. So the best piece of advice I got was, not surprisingly, from Kelly. Just focus on it. And it's like you said, it sort of got me to pull myself back together and do my job.
Kelly, have you dealt with these types of situations where you were having access problems because you're a woman?
I mean, thankfully, I don't have a lot of war stories.
Yeah.
You know, for whatever reason, for all
That's
the people
great.
that came before me, and also because of what I covered, I think.
And you said that about college football, right? Because
Yeah.
I remember back in our college days, there were some issues. Some colleges didn't allow people in, or only allow, but
Yeah.
it's good to hear if it made progress.
Because I think in early in my career, I covered college football, and at that time, there was only a very few locker rooms that were open. It was, Florida State. It depended on the coach. USC with Pete Carroll. Later, Rutgers had an open locker room. But I wasn't thrust into the situation where I had to, battle those battles for access, because it wasn't an option.
They would use
Post-game
rooms.
interview rooms where they would bring the players out, and we would all go, talk to the players, in different areas of the room. So, schools just gradually got away from the locker room situation. And as all of us can tell you, the locker room is a horrible place, to kind of do your job. Nobody likes going in there.
Doesn't smell real good either.
No, it doesn't.
Yes.
People I always laugh, like people say, oh, you get to go in the locker room? I'm like, no, I have to go in the locker room. Now, I don't want to give it back. I will say that flat out. I don't want to give up the access, because to me, what drives the best stories is the emotion, and the rawest emotion is in that locker room. So I'm not saying, I would still prefer the locker room professionally over interview rooms. Not at the college level, because I feel like college kids are different. They haven't signed on for, they're still amateurs. They haven't necessarily signed on for being exposed in that way, but professional sports.
But I think we can agree there are overall access issues today, because
Absolutely.
whether it's the pros or the colleges,
Everything
they
has
try
been
to
pulled
control
back.
the
Everything
situation,
has been
right?
pulled back, right?
Yeah.
And they have in-house writers and video people, and so
Yeah.
they're going to allow premier access for the people that they employ,
Right.
who are going to, presumably have more favorable coverage. That's a kind of a new frontier
Yeah.
for those of
No,
us in
they're,
the sports
they're
media.
hiring, forgive
Yeah.
me, they're hiring some of your colleagues
Yes.
to write for them and
Yeah. And
spin their
both-
stories,
yeah.
so to speak.
Yeah. And then you have things like the Players Tribune, which is the Derek Jeter-owned website where players are just going to that directly. And we end up using that as like another source, right? Because you end up writing stories sometimes based on what players have written on the Players Tribune. Have you found yourself doing that?
I think that some of the agents and public relations folks are some of the best writers I've ever read.
Yeah.
So, how
There's no
how
way.
do we know who's writing,
Who's writing
that
that stuff? Yeah, yeah.
I-
It's
I
why you
just
have to
sort of-
attribute it to said or wrote on the Players Tribune. Right.
but-
It's
Well,
not like
that's
a
why we tell
come out of their
students,
mouth.
make sure you know
What the
who's
source is.
actually doing this, what
Yeah.
the source is, do you have confidence that
point,
they're
yeah.
reliable, and so
Right.
on, right?
Yeah.
I think baseball is more, finds itself in more of a bind when it comes to clubhouse access than the other sports, because baseball sells personalities. It doesn't sell betting lines. It tried once and failed miserably when it flirted with the idea of replacement players. The other sports have
Kind of got away
replaced
with it.
its players because they found that they could set betting lines and the fans would still pay to see the sport. But baseball, they tried a spring filled with Tommy Lasorda saying, "Oh, look at Joe from the Bronx who used to drive a cab and now he's my first baseman." And the fans said, "No, we want Don Mattingly. We want, we want Derek Jeter at shortstop. We don't want Joe from the Bronx. We play baseball with him on Sunday. We
So
want
if they
our
cut the
guy."
access back,
Exactly.
they risk losing that conduit to the fans.
Exactly.
which plays
They
their bottom
want
line.
that immediacy.
Yeah.
They want that, as you said, that immediate reaction. They don't want it sanitized. They don't want.
Well, they
you
need
to-
it that way because it helps pay their.
Exactly.
bills.
And the players, every year they flirt with pushing everything back to an interview room, and there's
Well,
a negotiation with the
the other
baseball
element in
writers,
baseball
and it
is
doesn't
that-
happen.
And Claire knows this better than anybody, the Baseball Writers of America, that association is the strongest of any of those associations. You work for the Pro Football Writers college football writers. I've been involved with the Pro Football Writers, but the baseball writers who do ultimately vote for the Hall of Fame and they negotiate those agreements in terms of access, right? So they're going to fight a little more to keep that. Baseball still has the most media, even though they've pulled it back. They have
pulled
the most
it back, but
media access.
Still, after every game,
Well, even and
before
it's the pregame.
every
It's the
game,
pregame that
yeah.
is very different.
the problem that writers run into now has more to do with facilities than it has to
The
do.
fake locker room and the real locker room.
Right, exactly. If you can envision this, Yankee Stadium, the mausoleum, the new one, the Yankees clubhouse runs from the dugout to the foul pole. Okay, it has 2 pools, a weight room, a restaurant, a theater,
Lots of places to hide.
lots of places.
A racetrack.
And the
Bowling alley.
the locker room itself, where the lockers are, where the players are supposed to be, might be a little larger than this room.
Yeah.
There are a million places for them to go, and they go there.
Yeah. Not like the old one where they might duck into the trainer's room that was, off the corner.
And you can
could
wave
still
to
see
them.
You
And
can still see them
yeah,
in there.
exactly.
Yeah. That's a great point.
exactly.
It's not just about accessibility, the time, it's about where they can hide.
It took me 3 years to find out where Girardi's office was.
The real office or the one where he does the pregame interview that's like a little hole in the wall?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I was given a tour once during the winter of that locker room, and it just went on and on and on and on. I'm like, oh my God, no wonder we never see these guys.
So they can just choose when to come in or not to come in.
So that's an issue, which makes you kind of long for Wrigley and
Yeah.
and those
Well,
places.
let's talk a little bit more about women in the workplace for a few minutes, and both on the sports media side and elsewhere, because today women are in the majority in the workforce. Yet a U.S. Department of Education study shows that a year out of college, women on average make only about 80% of what their male colleagues do. And this week, I just saw it yesterday, the Women's Media Center's annual review of women in media was just released. Here are some statistics. At 20 of the top news outlets in our country, women reported only 37% of the stories. Male voices outnumber female voices at NPR by 2 to 1. The number of female sports editors across the country fell between 2012 and 2014, down to 9.8% of the editors. What, if anything, can be done about this?
The silence tells you how difficult that is to answer. I'm going to let Claire start.
You're speaking to the print media?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think this applies to diversity, race, gender, what have you. This is an industry that is imploding. So you have so many forces right now being pitted against each other. Editors-in-chief, managing editors are fighting to save their products. You have guilds, unions fighting to preserve seniority and the rights of its senior members. You have groups pushing for diversity, gender equality, trying to bring in a greater a group that more resembles society as a whole. All those groups are, in a way, pitted against each other. If you're fighting to preserve seniority, then when the layoffs, the inevitable layoffs hit, who's going to be laid off? Mm-hmm. The most recent group that comes in. Well, who's in the most recent group? The group that represented your latest diversity push, women, minorities. Then you're pitting the majority against the minorities, men against women. Mm-hmm. If I'm sitting in management, I'm caught between a rock and a hard place. I don't know what to do while I'm still trying to save as many jobs as I can in an industry that is imploding, that is slowly pulling so drastically within itself that it doesn't resemble what it looked like 2 years ago.
Well, couldn't the same thing on a different level be said about ESPN where you work, because we're now in a situation where they're starting to cut back because of the cord cutters who aren't subscribing the way they used to their service, right?
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I'd be lying if I said that people are walking around ESPN without a great deal of trepidation, because we read. We're not publishing anything about what might be coming around the corner, but everybody else is. Cable industry doesn't look like it looked in September. The subscribers are they dying? Where are they going? They're going into our watches and our iPads and our iPods and everything. So the sands are exactly, and so it's changing our world. And we used to be the safe haven for a lot of journalists.
In our next program, we'll focus more on the shortage of women in sports media. Special thanks to Eve Shanin at the Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center for hosting the panel. For more information on this or any edition of Carpe Diem, contact us at carpediem@mail.montclair.edu or call 973-655-5158. I'm Marc Rosenweig. From all of us at Montclair State University, thanks for watching Carpe Diem.